Well, the lull that has come over the crowd tells me it's time to start my part of this. I'm Valerie Hotchkiss, the University Librarian, and I'm very pleased to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming out in the rain, and welcome to Vanderbilt's libraries, where censorship has no home except as the topic of an intellectual discussion. I'm here not only to welcome you and thank you for coming, but also to thank a few folks who helped make this afternoon possible. We're really grateful to our co-sponsors, and those are the W.T. Bandy Center for Baudelaire and Modern French Studies, the French and Italian Department, and the Department of History at Vanderbilt. In addition, we have to thank a group of alums who have been fighting censorship for decades. And this is a group of alums called the Wild Bunch. It's their lecture fund here at the Jean and Alexander Hurd Libraries that is helping to support this event. The Wild Bunch students began as undergrads in the 1980s at Vanderbilt, and they had absolutely no understanding of Voltaire's dictate, quote, "To learn who rules over you, simply find out whom you are not allowed to criticize." They went straight to the top and told Chancellor Hurd exactly what they thought about everything. And to his credit, he listened to them and he asked for more critique. So that's who they are. The Wild Bunch members in attendance today are David Bloom, Kevin Ifiora, and Carolyn Jansen. Two others, Kathy Madigan and Donna Lilly, are stuck at an airport. I'm surprised they didn't commandeer a plane to get here. But the weather wouldn't permit it. Two of the names I just called out, Caroline and Kevin, are new members of the Wild Bunch Fund. So this is a group who, like the Shakers, realized that their days would be numbered if they didn't do something about it. So they have usually a contest every year, and the winners of that contest are always inducted into the Wild Bunch, so they will continue to grow. So I thank you all, and I thank you for what you stand for, especially the Wild Bunch. And now I'd like to turn the mic over to Robert Barsky, Professor of English, French, and Jewish Studies and Law, who will introduce our speaker. As a scholar with a tendency to cross cultural and genre borders, he is something of a kindred spirit with our distinguished speaker. And as the author of books and articles with titles that just include such words, I'm not going to tell you the titles, but they include such words as illegal, radical, undocumented, and dissent, I have no doubt that Professor Barsky is absolutely the perfect person to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. In 1940, a rather notorious Jewish New York publisher, bookseller, and translator was sentenced to 3 years in a Pennsylvania prison for publishing under a faux Mexican imprint the Medusa edition of Henry Miller's notoriously bawdy work, Tropic of Cancer. Miller hoped to take advantage of a pent-up demand for his novel, which had been published in Europe in 1934, but was banned in the US. So he got together with this notorious publisher, along with the great Joycean defender, Francis Steloff, and with Ben Abraham, to publish 500 copies of The Tropic of Cancer for each sponsor. Money for this publishing plan was in short supply, so Samuel Roth, the well-established pirate of James Joyce and D.H. Lawrence books, was willing to advance some funds, provided some signatures would be made available for him as well. Henry Miller was set to get 10% of the $7.50 retail price of the book. This edition of The Tropic of Cancer was notable because it preceded by 20 years Barney Rossett of Grove Press acquiring the American rights. In one of the many important obscenity trials of this century, Rossett was sued, and on February 21st, 1962, Judge Samuel B. Epstein of the Cook County Superior Court in Chicago rendered an 18-page decision that declared Tropic of Cancer not obscene. This notorious New York Jewish publisher, who had released the work to anxious American readers 20 years earlier, was named Jack Brussel. and he happens to have been the man who married my parents when they were both disowned for marrying outside of their respective faiths. Jack was a communist who, in the words of Walter Goldwater, was in trouble with the police ever since his earliest days, either for erotica or for stolen books or something else. This story is interesting for me, of course, not the least because 30 years after Jack married my parents, Jack's son, Carl, came to Quebec to claim refugee status after having been accused of tax fraud and obscenity in a trumped-up sweep of video distributors by the Department of Justice. And I landed up assisting in the process whereby Carl was able to stay in Canada. The US government, in both examples, was involved in state censorship and obscenity trials, not so much for reasons of public morality, but rather for the collection of taxes for the materials that were being sold. So needless to say, when through the generous support of Valerie Hotchkiss of the Heard Library, Yvonne Boyer of the W.T. Bandy Center, the Wild Bunch, just love that, and its lecture fund, the Departments of French and Italian, the Department of History, it was suggested that it might be possible to bring the indomitable Robert Darnton to present Censors at Work, How States Shaped Literature. I was over the proverbial moon. Robert Darnton has the kind of background, training, and academic career that researchers' dreams are made of. University professor, university librarian at Harvard, Rhodes Scholar, MacArthur Fellow, National Humanities Award Recipient, and, I might add, an extraordinarily kind and generous person. He is the founder of the extraordinary Gutenberg e-program and has put forth a proposal that we create a national digital library that would make our fellow citizens active members of an international republic of letters, strengthening the bonds of citizenship at home. He's the author and editor of many books, including, of course, The Great Cat Massacre and other episodes in French cultural history, The Devil in the Holy Water, or The Art of Slander in France from Louis XIV to Napoleon, and Poetry and the Police, Communication Networks in 18th Century Paris, in addition to the new book that you see outside. For this occasion, Professor Darnton is here to ask some of the critical questions that he poses in Censors at Work. What do censors actually do? To what end? How do they describe their work? How do they delineate this often arduous and politically volatile task? And to sum it up, how does their activity fit into the surrounding local and social political order? For a case like the Brussels, the answers turned out to be very complicated, tying in the Department of Revenue, the Department of Justice, the mob, and good old American Jewish anarchistic idealism. For the three cases that Darnton addresses, the socio-political and historical context are even more complex and very different one from the other. The old regime in France, British rule in India, and the so-called communist state that existed under the name of the German Democratic Republic from 1949 to 1990. Darnton's findings for each case are rich indeed. Not only does he delve deep into archival materials representing the joy of archival work that has made him the foremost historian of the book and the art of reading, but he does so employing a combination of insights from anthropology, history, literary studies, and, might I add, good old-fashioned detective work. In this case, in the latter case, actually, in the case of GDR, he also includes interviews that he conducted himself with the censors. The result, as is the case with all of Robert Darnton's sumptuous writings, is compelling, and he, appropriate to a space like this one, gives readers and researchers the desire to plunge into the archives themselves, guided by his remarkably astute approach to this fascinating field. We are very honored and very grateful to welcome to the Heard Library of Vanderbilt University, Professor Robert Darnton.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's my first time ever in Vanderbilt, and I'm just dazzled by your university, your campus. I'm learning things all the time, so I'm a happy, I guess, camper, you could say, but I'm camping in a lovely hotel for which I'm also grateful. But I'd like to express my thanks to the same group of people, namely, first of all, Bob Barsky and the Bandy Center, to Ivan Boyer, who's been guiding me around so far, and Valerie Hotchkiss, who's got this wonderful library under control. Also the French and the Italian department, the history department, and these famous wild bunchers. You sound like great people, and I'm so glad to be here. But I don't want to spend too much time expressing thanks because I've got a lot. I'm going to try to crowd into 50 minutes, if you can sit that long. And I'd like to begin with a general observation, which goes as follows. The history of censorship has a problem because it looks so simple. It seems to pit the champions of light against the evil forces of darkness. It's a kind of Manichaean view of things. And I think if you actually get into the way censorship operated, that's not entirely wrong, but it's not nearly adequate. The history of censorship is full of surprises, and it's a lot of fun to study. So having studied it now under 3 authoritarian regimes, I think we ought to rethink the history of censorship in general, and that's the case I'm going to try to present. But you might think I should begin with a definition. What is censorship, you could ask? Now, I'm not a great believer in definitions. Conceptual clarity, yes. But the problem with definitions is they tend to raise what the French call une question mal posée, a badly put question. Because if you begin by defining censorship, you tend to treat it as if it were a thing in itself, you know, something like radioactive material that you could trace through a bloodstream or through the body politic of any country. So instead of beginning with a definition, I would like to ask another question, one that the sociologist Irving Goffman proposes as a strategy for beginning any research project. The question is, according to Goffman, what is going on here? Sounds simple, but it has lots of complicated results. So what I want to do is find out what was going on in various systems of censorship. And to do that, I want to get inside the workings of the system. Have we got a problem?
Inside for just a moment. This system, it's
It needs
trying to
some,
restart, and just need to avoid that.
now, how do you get inside a system? Well, the idea is to consult the censors themselves about how they did their jobs, to listen to them carefully, because they can give you what anthropologists call the native's point of view. So the idea is to understand a pattern of behavior as it was understood by the people involved in it. And that is a kind of anthropological history, if you want to call it that. What it requires is a rich run of documents, not dozens, but hundreds, many hundreds of documents, so that you can steep yourself in the archives and get some sense of how it was a lived system for the people who operated it. So I am going to study 3 authoritarian regimes, as Bob mentioned: 18th century monarchical France, 19th century imperialist Britain, 20th century communist East Germany. And I should add that I'm studying the censorship of books, not of TV and journals and the internet. So let's begin with France. Now, I don't expect that you will be able to actually read these slides. They're just meant to suggest the nature of the documentation. This is a typical title page of an 18th century book. And what I hope you will notice is the very last line. It says, with the approbation and the privilege of the king. So privileges functioned as early modern versions of copyright, but they belonged to a completely different conceptual universe. And the whole notion of copyright is something really fascinating. A lot of people are studying it even today when it's moving a lot. A privilege was something peculiar to the old regime. And if there are any students here, I'm tipping my hand because the method I want to use is to try to show how books and censorship were part of a system that had its own, so to speak, rules of the game. In the case of France, the key idea, in my view, is privilege. Everyone in France, even peasants, had privileges of one kind of or other. The word was derived from the Latin private law. So what a privilege is you get to do something that other people can't do. And that's what everyone is about under the old regime in France. In the case of books, a privilege did convey the exclusive right to sell the book, kind of like copyright, but it was given by the grace of the king, not as a right. And secondly, the booksellers were privileged. You couldn't sell books unless you were a privileged bookseller, which meant you had to belong to a guild. Not easy to get into the guild. And that's the third level of privilege, the guild itself, which was a privileged corporate body with special exemptions from taxation and so on. So my point is that the book had participated in a system of privilege in at least 3 ways. And that's, I think, a good approach to trying to understand what actually is going on in the nature of privilege. But to get a privilege, a book had to get the approbation, as you see here, from a censor. And that's the way censorship, it's what censorship was all about. So what if you have, I'm sure, lots of 18th century books in your library here, I imagine, don't you? If you're students, I suggest you go to any legal book in your library and a legal book, not Voltaire, not Rousseau, and just look through it and you will see the approbation and the privilege because they were required to be actually printed in the book itself. And this is what some of them look like. Now again, I don't expect you to be able to read it. I just wanted to impress you with the amount of type that is conveying approbations and privileges. And also, I wanted to actually read a few snippets from the approbations. Remember Irving Goffman's question. One censor remarked, "I had pleasure in reading it. It is full of fascinating things." Another censor stressed its usefulness for travelers and for students in botany, and he especially praised its style. And a third censor simply attested that the book was a good read. He says in his approbation he couldn't put it down because of it's inspired in the reader, I'm quoting, "that sweet but avid curiosity that makes us want to continue further," end quote. Now I ask you, is this the language you would expect from censors? So I think we should go back to Irving Goffman's question, what is going on here? And to try to answer it, you need to get behind the title pages of books and into the memos and letters exchanged by the censors to other censors when they talk about the way they did their job. Now, fortunately, there is a marvelous collection of these documents, in-house material, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. I spent a lot of time reading them, and it's really quite interesting because it's full of surprises. While vetting manuscripts, they were talking about their jobs in the memos they wrote to one another. And when these memos were in favor of giving an approbation, the censors usually talked about, well, style and content. They sometimes even read like favorable book reviews. And then the negative memos, where they decide not to give an approbation, never mention an offense against the king, the church, or morality. Why not? Isn't that the job of censors? Well, the answer is, if you'd written such a book, if you were, say, Voltaire or Diderot, or Helvétius or D'Holbach, I mean, the famous philosophers, you never submitted your book to the censors in the first place. You sent it to Amsterdam or Geneva, where it would be printed and smuggled into France. France is surrounded by what I call a fertile crescent of publishing houses. The entire Enlightenment is produced outside France and smuggled in. So the censors are doing a different kind of job. They are really giving the royal stamp of approval. They're royal subjects appointed by the king, the royal stamp of approval about quality. And so it's fascinating to read their memos. One of them, for example, says it concludes that this manuscript should not receive an approbation, quote, "It is a compilation without taste and without discernment," end quote. So that one doesn't make it into print. Another memo rejected a defense of religious orthodoxy. Perfectly orthodox, the defense, but it was badly written. Quote, "It is not a book at all. You cannot tell what the author's purpose is until you have finished it. He advances in one direction, then doubles back. His arguments are often weak and superficial. His style, in an attempt to be lively, merely becomes petulant. In the effort to turn a pretty phrase, he frequently looks silly and ridiculous," end quote. So that's how censors talk about books when they're dealing privately with one another. And they were themselves often, almost always, men of letters. Many were college professors. They even knew the authors whose works they censored and suggested ways to improve the text. Their main concern, as one of them put it, was, I quote, "to defend the honor of French literature," end quote. "Je défends l'honneur de la littérature française." That's what they thought they were doing. So censorship was essentially positive. It was the counterpart, I don't know if you've ever seen these things, if you've been to England, to the jars of jam and other objects by special appointment to Her Majesty the Queen. It's a mark of quality, of royal approbation. Now, of course, there was more to it than that. By 1789, the Direction de la Librairie, that's the bureaucracy in charge of the book trade, which was really a kind of ministry of culture, included nearly 200 censors. It's a big deal. Most of them received no payment for their work, but by being a censor, you got prestige, your name appeared in the Royal Almanac, and you were in the running for getting a pension or a special appointment from a system in which patronage was the key factor. But you had to do a lot of paperwork, and I've just got some examples of the paperwork for you to see. Don't worry, I won't go into the details, but what I want to get across is, you see, it's a printed form, and then they fill it in hands. Imagine thousands and thousands of these forms, which the censors are filling out and filing and sending to one another. Sometimes it's all in a very close handwriting, and they give you a sense of, well, bureaucracy. The word bureaucrat, appears in the French language for the first time in the middle of the 18th century. So it all sounds rather innocent, doesn't it? But of course it wasn't. There was much more to it than that. And so I should mention a final factor, which was post-publication censorship. Some books that did receive approbations and privileges turned out to be scandalous because the censors screwed up. And there are famous examples of this. The most famous is probably the great Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert, which had a royal privilege until people started reading between the lines. I could give you wonderful examples, but I don't have time. But there were really shocking things in this, and the church got mobilized. The privilege was withdrawn. It was the great scandal and breakthrough, in a way, of the Enlightenment in the 1750s and into the 60s. There was the famous affair about De l'Esprit by Helvetius, and I could go on, giving you a few examples of books that received privileges but turned out to have shocking material, and so the authors were humiliated. They could be sent to the Bastille. The books were banned, and that was the end of that. But there was also another form of post-publication censorship that was very important in France, and that was the police. There were special inspectors of the book trade. One of them, a man called Joseph Demery, was an extraordinary fellow. I've been following him through the archives. He knew all the major writers in France. He kept a file on 500 authors between 1748 and 52. And he talked about their style as well. He said about one author, well, he can manage prose okay, but he can't write Alexandrine verse. Can you imagine a cop saying that in New York today? So these are sophisticated people at a high moment in French literature, but they also threw people into the Bastille. Demery trapped many authors and many booksellers and publishers. Now, the Bastille itself was not a three-star hotel, as some historians seem to think. You know, there's this tendency to say, well, the old regime wasn't all that bad. No, no one was tortured in it, but it could ruin your life. And if you were a bookseller, you had bills you have to pay all the time. And if you're in the Bastille, normal period of time, imprisonment would be 3 to 6 months. That's enough to make you bankrupt. So I've spent months and months in the papers of the Bastille, and what I see is broken lives. It was really tough. And of course, these police could haul anyone into the Bastille. There are no lawyers, there's no accusation. You're just sitting there until they decide to release you. So, although it was formally positive, censorship under the old regime in France was also repressive. It definitely had a dark side. That's the first case study. I'd like to skip over the second one, British India, and come back to it later because I want to concentrate on communist East Germany, which is, I think, the least understood of all of these regimes. So I'm going to move ahead. I spent, historians sometimes choose the right year to be someplace, and I chose the year 1989 to 1990 to be in Berlin at the Wissenschaftskolleg, an institute for advanced study. No, I shouldn't say that I really expected anything to happen. Nobody knew the end of the Cold War was coming with the fall of the wall. It took us completely by surprise. But when it hit, it was extraordinary. I was sitting there writing another monograph on the 18th century when the ground began to shake, and I decided I would drop everything and just go to the demonstrations, talk with people, just listen to how they were understanding a process that I didn't know at first was going to end with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Empire. I had some East German friends who were publishers and writers, and they said to me, "You're interested in censorship in 18th century France. Would you like to meet some censors?" "Hell yes," I said. So one thing led to another, and before long I was sitting in 90 Clara Zetkinstraße. That was the huge bureaucracy of the Ministry of Culture with a whole floor devoted to censorship. And I got to meet two censors. It had been arranged through my East German friends who had dealt with them all the time and who assured the censors I was not on a witch hunt. I just wanted to know how they did their job. There were two of them, Hans-Jürgen Wesner and Christine Horn. They had never set foot in West Berlin, although the wall was only about 20 yards away. They had never seen an American, and here was this strange animal sitting in their office having coffee with them. And they didn't quite know what to make of me. They were, of course, a little worried, a little skeptical, but at that point the wall had fallen, and so had the East German government. I mean, it collapsed. Even the Communist Party had collapsed. And so the bureaucrats, including the censors, showed up for work, but there was no state. This was before the two Germanys had been united, and it was a fascinating moment, a kind of pause in history in which you could get everything seemed fluid and possible, and we didn't know what was going to happen. So here was this strange animal, this American, asking them questions about censorship. And the conversation actually began in which Herr Wesner looked at me. He was a little skeptical, and he said, it began by saying, "You have censorship in your country." "Oh," I said, "yes, it's the marketplace." Well, I had been through that argument, and I said, okay, but you are a censor. What is censorship to you? And then Herr Wesner answered in one word: planning. Literature must be planned, like everything in a socialist society. Literature is a matter of social engineering. And then he reached into a drawer of his desk and he pulled out a thick document, and this is the first page of it. Or did I show it to you in the... Yeah, this is the first page of it. This was the plan for the year 1990. A year that never existed in East German literature. Every single book in East German literature that was to be published in that year appeared in the plan. It was highly organized. They gave you the information about the author, the publisher, the series in which the book would appear, and a summary of its plot. And then Herr Wesner actually gave me this copy of the plan, which I studied carefully in subsequent days. It was very, very interesting. You had a whole year's worth of literature that never happened, and you could get a sense of what, in the eyes of the censors, should appear in print as a matter of social engineering. Then he reached into another drawer, and he pulled out another document, which is this one, but don't worry, I don't expect you to read the small type, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what documents looked like in that time. It had a long German word, Themenplan Einschätzung, and what that means is basically the ideological justification of the plan, the previous document, that the censors prepared for the Communist Party. So a quick word about where the Communist Party fits into all of this. I see some young students, you probably don't know much about how communism was organized. It probably seems like a long time ago. The basic principle is you had two parallel systems. The state with ministries, and that's what you see on the upper part of the slide, and then a parallel organization, which was the Communist Party, the parties in the upper part, and the government, the state, is on the lower part. And the Communist Party had at its very top Erich Honecker, who was the great supreme power and the head of the Communist Party in East Germany. And there were political divisions, and I hope you can see it, right above the broken line, a department known as culture, Kultur, a culture department. The culture department was run by a dragon lady called Ursula Ragwitz. And Ursula Ragwitz had 15 or so Stalinistic bureaucrats who were, like her, determined to make sure that nothing offensive to the party would appear in print. Now the censors, this is according to the description of the censors. The censors were in the government, in the Ministry of Culture, and they actually believed in German literature, in the quality of German literature. They had PhDs in German literature. They knew Goethe and Schiller backward and forward. They were sort of bureaucrats who were not failed academics, but who chose to make their way in the apparatus of the state. They were members of the Communist Party, but they sympathized with a lot of the authors whose work they censored. So they presented themselves as kind of dealing for, well, the value of literature within the system. They believed in the system, they thought social engineering was a good thing, but they didn't like these Philistines in culture on the other side of East Berlin, where the Communist Party had its headquarters. So once a year, their leader, and they adored him, a man called Klaus Höpke, would take the plan under his arm. He would go over to the Communist Party and duel with Frau Ragwitz and come back, and she would then not allow this and not allow that, and they would adjust the plan, and the result was East German literature. So it was a fascinating process, and of course, in talking to me, the censors were trying to justify themselves, but they had a lot of interesting things to say. For example, I asked them, what do you actually do? What sort of things do you cut out of a manuscript when you were censoring it? And they paused and they said, well, ecology. The word ecology was not allowed. Why? Because the pollution in East Germany was unbelievable, especially in cities that were involved in the chemical industries. I went and did some interviews with people there, and they said you had to have windshield wipers on your glasses. It was so hard to see. So no, the word ecology couldn't exist. Another one was dissent, because of course there were no dissenters in Germany. They didn't want to admit that there was opposition within the system. And curiously, another expression they said that they would delete was the 1930s. Why? Because it suggested the Stalinist purges. And instead you would have to say the first half of the 20th century. So there were things that the censors cut out, and they understood that. But they said, we didn't actually do much cutting at all, because the manuscripts that arrived in our office had already been censored in the publishing houses. And in fact, this was a surprise to me, East German writers almost never turned in complete manuscripts. No, they would turn in, first of all, a suggestion. They would talk it over with their editors, who were members of the Communist Party, usually, and had to report to the head of the publishing house, who was a real apparatchik. And then they would negotiate as to what the book should actually contain, and they would submit it chapter by chapter, discussing each chapter with the editors, who would make sure that nothing offensive appeared. So a lot of censorship took place at that level. And even more took place at another level, namely in the mind of the author. It was self-censorship, because the authors had to make careers, and you couldn't have a career if you weren't a member of the Communist Party or at least a member of the Authors Union. Otherwise, it was impossible even to be a writer. So we're talking about a very complex system in which the state has control in lots of different ways. But a key factor, I think, is these people were true believers. The censors really thought that they were building socialism, what they called socialism with a human face, and they were improving the quality of literature in East Germany. So they too, like their French counterparts, thought that censorship was positive, a way of constructing a socialist society. Of course, it involved compromise and complicity at every point, but that exists in every society. No, they said to me. And the operations of the marketplace in capitalist society was far worse in their eyes than the fundamental realities as they understood them in the communist system. Okay, it was a very interesting conversation. I actually wrote an article about it for a German publication, and it caused a bit of scandal because I didn't sound anti-communist enough when the West Germans were dumping on the East Germans. But I did realize that there was a great deal of self-justification in the self-presentation of the censors, and I wanted to find out, well, as far as I could, what the real story was. So I went to the archives of the Communist Party. Now, well, you're too young to imagine the kind of fear you might feel in walking into the jaws of the Communist Party, but of course it had collapsed, so there was really no danger for me. However, the office was near Alexanderplatz in East Berlin. I walked in. They had never seen this strange animal, an American, and I said, could I do research in your archives? I mean, the idea of an American doing research in the archives of the Communist Party in the spring of 1990 was extravagant. On the other hand, why not? So they said, okay. And I won't go into the details, but I was able to study the actual memos, again, exchanged by the people inside the party as they tried to control literature in the way they wanted it. Also, I was able to go back regularly to East Berlin over the next 5 years. So I spent a lot of time in the archives of the Communist Party, and I could tell you stories about that, but I don't want to take too long. The basic idea was, were these censors making themselves sound much gentler and kinder and more cultivated than they actually were? What was their real behavior like? Well, I found out that the very censors with whom I had talked had actually participated in purges, and that their boss, this hero who did battle against Frau Rogwitz, this man called Klaus Höpke, he had a strong Stalinist streak. One example, I found a memo he wrote in 1978 when there was a debate in the Ministry of Culture about whether the East Germans should publish an edition of Kierkegaard. And in the memo, he said, "Nein, absolutely not." And now I'm quoting, "If Kierkegaard belongs to our literary heritage, then so do Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Freud, Kafka." All of these writers were forbidden in East Germany. Besides, In deciding what can be published from late bourgeois philosophy, we want, first of all, to take into account the situation in the ideological class war. We have had enough of individualistic attitudes to life and lifestyles, end quote. So Kierkegaard was not published in East Germany. The system involved plenty of banning books and pulping books, those that appeared and then shocked members in the Communist Party, along with spying, denunciation, manipulation of all kinds. And this went right up to the top with Erich Honecker, the head of the state and of the party, and his right-hand man, a guy called Kurt Hager, who was the expert in ideology. How did they control authors? Because, of course, they wanted the right sort of literature to appear. Well, I found a whole dossier about that very subject. What did the authors want? Well, of course, they wanted to get published, but they also, in many cases, wanted to buy a car. To get a car in East Germany, sometimes you had to wait 20 years for one of these little Tabi cars. They wanted to move from one city to another. You couldn't do that without the permission of the police. They wanted a better apartment. They wanted to get their children into a university. They wanted to read the West German press if they could, and above all, they wanted to travel. They were obsessed with the desire to see what things were like in West Germany and other countries. And so you could manipulate them by giving them these little favors. So it was, in that sense, manipulative, but not bone-crushing. Of course, most of the documents I consulted came from the 1980s, when things were relatively better. Right after World War II, there was a gulag, and authors were killed. It was very, very brutal. In later years, control was maybe less brutal, but more pervasive, thanks to the Stasi. And I'm sure you've heard about the secret police, which developed incredible surveillance techniques, tapping telephones and getting denunciations, wives against husbands. Everyone in East Germany had a dossier. And I even found out later that I had a dossier myself. So there was a kind of all-pervasive control on the part of the police. So what was it like, actually, to be a writer under these circumstances? Well, fortunately, I also studied, they had papers for each of the publishing houses, and you could take an author and follow his or her career in great detail. So I just mentioned a couple of, one example in particular, so you would know how the system operated as it was experienced by one of the authors. And that was a man called Fokker Brown. Now, probably none of you have heard of Fokker Brown, but he was the star writer in the 1970s and 1980s. He was the most glamorous, if you like, type. If you've ever seen the movie Other People's Lives about East Germany, I think he was the model for the key person in that movie, which is a wonderful and accurate movie about communist East Germany. Anyhow, he was a star, and he especially appealed to young people because he seemed cool. He could, he went dancing and jazz, and he took risks. He criticized the party, although he was a loyal member, but he pushed the envelope in the direction of the left. He wanted a real revolutionary society, and the bureaucrats in power were quite threatened by this. So they wanted to control him because he had such appeal. They didn't want him to run away from East Germany to the West, or to be known as a dissident. So how could they control him? Well, I actually found a memo about this very problem dated January 7th, 1976, in which the Minister of Culture, the head woman in the culture department of the party, and the head of censorship got together and said, what are we going to do about Fokker Brown? And the answer was, we've got to give him, carrot and stick. So they said he's got to make a public renunciation of left-wing deviationism, Trotskyite. 2, we won't allow any of his books to be reviewed in the East German press. 3, he has to make a public confession of a thing called Parteilichkeit, party loyalty, which was the highest value. But then there was the carrot side. There were incentives. So 1, they would allow him to subscribe to Die Zeit, the West German, very good weekly newspaper. 2, they would print his complete plays, special edition. And 3, they would allow him to go to Cuba and improve his suntan. Well, he was actually intending to write a play about Che Guevara. And so he went to Cuba, and he came back with the text of the play, which he submitted to the censors. They were horrified. And the documents show him negotiating with the censors for month and months. And it even includes his drafts of especially the first act and the last act, which were offensive to the censors. Why? Because Guevara comes out as a hero. He goes to Bolivia and then continues the revolution, while Fidel Castro remains in Havana at the head of a bureaucracy that is becoming more and more fossilized. And the message would be offensive to the Cubans, of course, but dangerous for the Germans, the East Germans. So Fokker Brown had to completely rewrite the play, change the ending and so on, and I could follow it through all of the drafts. But at last, the Deutsches Theater was allowed to begin rehearsing for the performance. It was going to be a big deal. 13 days before opening night, the Cuban ambassador stormed into the Ministry of Culture and they said, "You cannot allow this play. It's an attack on Fidel Castro." There was a big kerfluffle, and the thing went right up to Erich Honecker at the top, and he canceled the play. So it's a good example of how censorship operated when things got really hot. I'll mention one last thing. I shouldn't spend too much time talking about East Germany, but I think people don't know much about it, and it's really, I found it endlessly fascinating. The last example concerns the most famous writer in East Germany, more famous in fact than Fokker Brown, and she wrote a book that everyone read called Cassandra. Her name was Christa Wolf. Have any of you heard of Christa Wolf? Yeah. You know, she was the moral voice of East Germany, a loyal socialist. She would not emigrate. She was a really fine writer, and she spoke to East Germans with a kind of authority that was truly exceptional. So she could cut special deals with the censorship when she published her books. One of the things she required was that censored passages could be cut, but they had to indicate the cuts through square brackets and ellipsis dots, ... And okay, they agreed to do that because she was so important. They also agreed to let her publish the uncensored versions of Cassandra in West Germany. The West Germans copied out the censored passages, typed them on bits of paper, which were then circulated in East Germany, and you could insert them in the right pages. So I was given a set of these typed out censored passages. You see one there on the right, and then if you look on the upper left, you can see the square brackets and the ellipsis dots where that passage had been cut. So if you read the book with the little bits of paper, those passages come alive and they seem much more seditious, if you want to call it that, than they would have been had they been allowed. So how did censorship end in East Germany? I could go on, and I'll stop. But basically by the fall of the wall. Now, quickly, I'm going to talk about censorship in British India. I find it also endlessly interesting because it deals with a contradiction that I think was at the heart of British imperialism, certainly in the Raj in India. That was a contradiction between liberalism and imperialism. Now, you may not think of imperialism as at all liberal. After all, it's conquest of and creation of colonies. But the British were true liberals. And if you look at those who first designed and ran the British India, they were devout liberals. John Stuart Mill, James Mill, Macaulay, and also John Morley, who may not be familiar to you, but he was a biographer of Gladstone, the supreme liberal. He also became Secretary of State for India, so he was the most important person in the cabinet of the Liberal government elected in 1905, a very important year in Indian history. So we're talking about liberals who believe in the liberal principle of the freedom of the press. That means no censorship, at least not before publication. And that principle goes back to 1695 in England. It's connected with trial by jury and all kinds of liberal institutions. And they were all actually applied to British India, where there was also no censorship before publication, and also there was trial by jury. So what happened when things went wrong? Well, one case is this book, Neal Darpan, which began as a play in the wonderful, vibrant, popular culture stage of Calcutta. It was an extraordinary period of effervescence, and a lot of them were melodramas. Neal Darpan was a melodrama about the wicked English who exploited peasants as slaves, virtually, in the indigo industry, which was very important in the mid-19th century. So this play is extraordinarily violent in its attacks on the British. No one is mentioned by name, but it was, of course, in Bengali, and the planters didn't worry much about that until it was translated into English. And then they were really worried because it could get back to Parliament. And there were backbenchers who thought that maybe the Indians were being exploited in some way by the Brits. So they, as soon as it came out in English, they charged the man who was involved in its publication, a very interesting character called James Long. They charged him with seditious libel. They brought him to trial, and he was condemned to prison for libel. But how could you libel people who weren't even named, and were groups, not individuals? It didn't bother the judge. You read all the transcripts of the play, and so this book, which was known as the Indian Uncle Tom's Cabin, was banned, and the publisher, so to speak, was sent to jail. So yes, the British were often quite repressive. They could be, but basically they kept their hands off. And instead, they watched carefully what the Indians were publishing. Now, we're just beginning to develop a publishing history of India. It's a huge subject and very interesting. As you know, in 1857, there was what some Indians call the first Indian Revolution, what the English call the Sepoy Mutiny, but there was a vast, violent episode in which the Indians rose and controlled large chunks of India by force, and they had to be suppressed by the British troops. And the British then said to themselves, we need to not just gun down the natives, we need to understand them. They realized that they didn't understand what was going on among the natives. They call them the natives. And so they began to study in a systematic way everything about India and to do surveys. They did surveys of agriculture and demography and you name it, and finally of books, because books mattered. And the way they did these surveys is they had special agents who ran libraries and other cultural institutions where books had to receive permission to be published, who kept records and wrote reports. And these reports were published in something that has a very, it's badly named, but they were called catalogs. They were top secret, although they were printed for the members of the India Civil Service as it began to get organized to control India. And there are a lot of them. So I spent a great deal of time reading all of these entries about books. There were 200,000. 200,000. That's more books than were published in all of France in all of the 17th and 18th centuries. It was a gigantic literature in many, many different languages. And if you read the reports, what you see is the discourse on native literature by the imperialist powers. It's absolutely fascinating. And so I would say, talking about liberalism, that the British Raj corresponded perfectly to Michel Foucault's formula, survey and punish. They surveyed through the catalogs, they knew exactly what was being published, and then they were ready to punish if things fell apart. Well, things did fall apart, but first I should just mention something about the catalogs. You notice all that print at the top. That's column 16. So the British were systematic in the way they kept records about native publications, author, publisher, press run, and so on and so on. And then column 16 is just called remarks. And the remarks grew and grew and grew over the years so that column 16 spills over and has to be extended over the entire page in many cases. They are actual book reviews. And they're very funny sometimes because what you see is the gulf between this Victorian mentality on the part of the bureaucrats in the India Civil Service on the one hand, and the bawdiness of the Indian writers on the other. So they're always being shocked by sex, especially Krishna's dallying with the milkmaids, which is a favorite theme of the Indians. One of the reports described a book saying as, quote, the most openly vulgar and obscene observations ever made, not even having the semblance of an excuse for the public good, it should be at once suppressed, end quote. But it wasn't suppressed. Why? Because of the liberal value of freedom of the press. Let them publish if there's not going to be any sedition. So, despite protests like this, the Raj rarely repressed books until things really got hot. They got hot in 1905 with the decision by the British to partition Bengal. I won't go into the details, but there was a huge and very important nationalist movement. And the partition resulted in violence on the part of some of the nationalists who even resorted to terrorism. So they blew up 2 English women who were in a railroad carriage at one point, and the British had decided they had to do something about it, so they started arresting all of these people on whom they'd been keeping reports over decades and decades. They arrested them on a large scale, authors, publishers, printers, and they didn't just arrest them, as the French would have done, send them to the Bastille. No, they were liberals, so they put them on trial. And I read the reports of the trials, which are fascinating because the British want to prove that they respect the principle of freedom of the press, but they also need to repress the freedom of the press. And you get these arguments because the defense had a right to lawyers. And the lawyers were trained in British schools according to the principles of British common law. So the defense attorneys would cite Shakespeare and Sidney and Milton against the prosecution, which was saying this is just sedition. I won't go into the details, but some of it's really very funny because the juries were presented with literal translations from the native languages. And I found lots of cases in which you can't really make out the meaning if you read the literal translation. So the two attorneys, the defense and the prosecutor, say what it means. Well, I found one example in which the prosecutor said, this sentence says, rise up and throw out the English. And the defense says, oh no, if you know Bengali and the Sanskrit roots, it's got very complicated grammar, you can realize the meaning of the sentence is, go out and make money by becoming a businessman. So you got a kind of hermeneutic duel in these cases that I found fascinating to read. But the result in every case was that the men, there were no women, were sentenced to long periods of imprisonment. It was real serious repression. So now it's time for some concluding remarks. But you see, I'm just trying to characterize three different systems. And after getting to know them from the inside, can you ask questions about censorship in general? Far from being the same thing everywhere and at all times, it has varied according to the character of each regime. It should be studied, I believe, ethnographically as an ingredient of a political culture and not simply as the villain of a story that always has the same plot, repression versus liberty. In all three cases, one can see how political cultures crystallized around core principles, if you call them that. Privilege in the case of France, surveillance in the case of British India, and planning in the case of communist East Germany. In each one, censorship pervaded every aspect of literary life and shaped literature itself as a cultural system within the socio-political order. It took place at the everyday level through a constant process of interpretation, compromise, complicity, and negotiation. Does censorship, therefore, involve constraints of every kind, including the marketplace as understood by Marxists, the subconscious as studied by Freudians, and in fact every speech act as analyzed by literary theorists? Well, there's one theorist that I find especially repulsive, called Stanley Fish. He wrote he's very famous, he's an important literary critic and very intelligent, and he wrote an article and then a whole book entitled, There's No Such Thing as Freedom of Speech, and It's a Good Thing, Too. Why? Well, because every speech act, every gesture is constrained. You filter everything you do, every word you speak, the way you sit in a chair, everything. So there are examples of censorship. I've often asked my students to cite, what is censorship aside from burning books at this level of everyday life? Well, they say, calling a professor, brushing your teeth at night, wearing a necktie or not wearing a necktie. Everything you do is filtered by constraints. But I think if censorship is everything, then it is nothing. The postmodernist view of it trivializes it. I think we should take seriously the testimony of authors who suffered from censorship, notably during the Cold War. And there's a whole literature written by authors of what it was like to write under these conditions. Of course, Alexander Solzhenitsyn is the most famous, but he was in Russia. There was Milan Kundera in Czechoslovakia, Czesław Miłosz in Poland, Norman Manea in Romania, Danilo Kish in Yugoslavia. They all wrote accounts of how censorship operated and how they themselves experienced it. There was a very interesting East German writer called Erich Löst who specialized in detective stories. And he said, when I wrote in East Germany, there was a little green man in my ear. And this little green man said to me, "Are you sure you wanted to write that? That could get you in trouble." So self-censorship was absolutely central to all of these things. Now, I take the testimony of these writers as an argument against the postmodernized trivialization of the concept of censorship. In my own conception, censorship concerns power monopolized by the state, or in some cases by the church, rather than power as constraint of every kind. But in taking this position, I have to confront what could be called the Anthropologists' Dilemma. When anthropologists go into the field, they attempt to be neutral and to engage in a dialogue with the people that they study. But they often run into practices that horrify them, such as female circumcision. No matter how hard they try, they cannot suspend their own values or avoid the pull of ethnocentrism. So I admit that there is an ethnocentric element in my own attempt to take an anthropological view of censorship. It concerns the First Amendment to the American Constitution. Despite the scorn of literary critics like Stanley Fish, he calls it First Amendment pieties, which he thinks is ridiculous. Myself, I subscribe to the principle of freedom of speech as it is guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution. And yet, at the same time, I must recognize the culture-bound character of that commitment. Because, of course, the First Amendment doesn't apply everywhere. It's peculiar to the United States. Now, freedom of expression does exist, can be found in many other political cultures, along with the same tension between relativism and commitment. What then should we conclude? In my view, we need to understand censorship, not merely to condemn it. But while making an attempt at understanding, I think we must also take a stand against it, especially today when the state, with help from Google and Facebook, is watching every move we make. Thank you. Yes. So the question is about burning books. Were books actually burned? In the case of France, yes. And I've been looking for detailed descriptions of the book burnings. I found one picture, not a very good one, and I haven't found the detailed descriptions that an ethnographer would like, but there was a ceremony. And if a book was condemned by the Parliament of Paris, for example, which often happened after publication, the master of high works, le maître des hautes œuvres, who was the public hangman, would burn, first he would lacerate the book at the bottom, in the courtyard of the great staircase to the Palais de Justice in Paris. He would lacerate it and burn it, and people would stand around and watch. So yes, book burnings did exist in France. I've not found a single example of them in the British Raj, nor in East Germany. Of course, the Nazis were famous for their book burnings, but not the communists. They wanted to indicate what separated them from the Nazis, although they sent many of the authors whom they imprisoned to the very same camps that the Nazis had used.
You ended by talking a little about Google and Facebook, and I wonder if you're, the East Germans were talking about the market's ability to censor, which might even be more powerful today than it is then. I mean, thinking about like Twitter or something, where if someone says something that's out of bounds according to what Twitter thinks is okay to say, that person can be banned from. Wondering if you think about that.
Well, yes, first I was careful to say I'm talking about books, not electronic communication. Once you get into electronic communication, of course you have to deal with the means of communication, the technology and the rest of it. And then you're in another world. But of course, there's enormous censorship in the electronic world. The Chinese are this great firewall of China and so on. And I think you could describe the so-called silo effect of certain Facebook publics who only talk to one another and refuse to even consider information from outside the silo as a kind of self-imposed censorship. But there are many cases with Facebook, you probably have read about them, and Google too, which wanted to conquer the Chinese market, collaborated with the Chinese, and then withdrew to Hong Kong, and so on. So yes, I think there's a huge amount of censorship going on. What about in our country? Well, again, you will ask Irving Goffman's question, what is going on here? But my friends who are computer scientists say that in your ordinary transactions, if you order something by Amazon, for example, that is tapped directly into these great farms where computer databases are kept. So that's what I mean when I say they know every move we make. The companies know it, but the federal government knows it too. And so I think we are in a kind of 1984 society, 1984 being way behind us, in which surveillance is pervasive. We do have an independent judiciary, and we have a constitution, and I mean that's why I say I think the First Amendment is just an extraordinary thing, crucial, I think, to our system. But I see it as a system that's under siege.
Do you think the Pentagon Papers would have been published today?
I don't know. The question was, would the Pentagon Papers have been published today? I used to work for the New York Times, and so I know the people who published them, and the Sulzberger family ultimately made the decision. I thought it was a very brave decision, and it turned out to have done a lot of good. Now, I'm a little bit out of touch. I don't know the current, well, I never knew the Sulzbergers very well. I met them. So I can't speak to the owners of the New York Times today. My guess is they would say yes. But you wouldn't have the Pentagon, you'd have something different from the Pentagon Papers. What would that be? Well, an editor has to make a decision every day. You make a decision about how many words to allot to a story, where to put it in the paper, what kind of headline to attach to it. All of this has to do with the meaning of the story. And then if you're dealing with something as enormous as information leaked, well, that's a serious business. And I think the New York Times takes its responsibility very seriously. I don't know the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, et cetera. But for me, that kind of free press lives in a world where there are compromises that are worked out. Everything is being negotiated all the time. So in general, I'm trying to avoid a Manichaean view of censorship and to indicate how, in reality, everyone's negotiating all the time, but there are some governing principles, such as the First Amendment.